Hello, everyone out there on the internet, on Zoom, and on Facebook Live. This is From Revelation to Realization, Matan Torah and Shavuot. Tonight, for the last time in this series, we have the pleasure of learning with Miss Sarah Gordon. Shavuot is a captivating holiday with dual significance. On one hand, it holds a legal aspect, emphasizing the giving of the Torah through the reading of the Ten Commandments. On the other hand, it embraces a human dimension through the Book of Ruth, a narrative centered around the harvest and the acts of kindness within the community. This course will emphasize the complementary nature of both aspects. First, we'll examine various models of revelation. Then we will shift our focus to realization, delving into the physical challenges when living a Torah-guided life in society. Through these texts, the course will address questions such as, what does it look like practically for a society to live according to Torah law? What needs to shift, and what accommodations need to be made? What messages do we both get from the law and narrative sections of Torah? And for anyone who's not had the pleasure of learning before with Ms. Sarah Gordon, she is the Senior Director of Israel Education at AMER for Unpacked for Educators. She is previously the Director of Israel Guidance at Mayanot, as well as a teacher of Talmud. And it's a pleasure to have her teaching here for one last time in this session. If anyone out there who's watching has questions during class, we do want to hear what you have to say. Please do ask them. You can ask them on chat on both Zoom and Facebook Live, and I will bring them to Ms. Gordon's attention. Or if you're on Zoom, you can ask directly. And if you want to be able to ask directly, I'll send you an invitation to be a panelist where you can unmute yourself and turn on your camera. But you're also welcome to use the raise your hand function or ask me in chat to make you a panelist. Sources for today will be posted in chat momentarily. And with that, I want to hand things over.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the Drisha Institute, to Kayla Blum for running everything here on the back end, making sure that trains are running on time, and to Rabbi John Kelson as well for organizing all the shiurim for this Zman. So with that, I'm actually just going to quickly share my screen, and then we will jump right in to this session. Here we go. All right, great. So everyone now should be able to see my screen. So with that, today is really the final session in our 4-part series on From Revelation to Realization. We spent the first 2 shiurim doing deep dives into Revelation, to Matan Torah, into the 10 Commandments, into the legal aspect of the holiday of Shavuot. And then we spent last class, and also what we're going to spend time doing today, talking about the realization. What happens when these laws that are given at Har Sinai are put into practice in the community described in Megillat Ruth? And we spoke about, again, that tension, that dialectic between these 2 aspects of Shavuot, getting the legal aspect, Matan Torah, Har Sinai, and the other text that we read on Shavuot, that we'll be reading next week, Megillat Ruth, where we see what happens in the community in Beit Lechem. We spoke last week a little bit about the messiness of putting chesed into practice and seeing that take place in Megillat Ruth, the difference between din and lifnei mishurat hadin, going kind of to, keeping the letter of the law versus going beyond the letter of the law. And that's kind of one aspect that we saw with how these laws are put into practice in the community in Megillat Ruth. But tonight, I really want to take a little bit of a different aspect, still focusing on that community in Megillat Ruth. What we're going to do tonight is we're really going to look at comparing a few different stories in Tanakh that have a lot of parallels to Megillat Ruth. And by comparing and contrasting them, we'll be able to pull out, I think, hopefully some interesting insights about the community in Megillat Ruth, especially vis-a-vis this challenge of taking the legal aspect of Matan Torah, the laws that were given, and being able to put them into practice. So with that, let's jump in. So by way of introduction, again, just giving a little bit more background as to kind of some of the Tanakh methods or methodologies that we're going to put into practice tonight. Sometimes in Tanakh, we can find that different texts or stories often have many similar parallels. They can be thematic parallels. These could be linguistic parallels, similar words, storylines, and it almost seems as if we're being nudged as students of Tanakh to compare and contrast them, to pull out some meaningful takeaways. Academically, this could be called, or this is often called, intertextuality, where almost it's seen as if these parallel texts are commenting on each other. And our goal tonight is really to apply this method of study to Megillat Ruth to be able to answer, again, that overarching theme or question of from revelation to realization. So we're going to compare the story that we have towards the end of Megillat Ruth, of Ruth and Boaz in the Goren at the threshing floor, to some parallel stories found in other areas of Tanakh. And the main narrative that I want to start with in Megillah Ruth, as we said, is going to be that narrative in the Goren. But the main kind of story that I want to contrast it to is going to be that of Yehuda and Tamar in Sefer Bereshit and in the book of Genesis. And for that, what we're going to do is in source number 1, and I'll scroll down, I'll read in Hebrew, but I'm going to translate in English. What we're going to have a chance to see is, first of all, just as we go through the story of Yehuda and Tamar, we're going to see automatically a lot of things that might set off some light bulb moments for us, right? That might jog our memory and say, hey, this sounds familiar. Either that story of Ruth and Boaz at the threshing floor, which don't worry, we're going to spend time looking at that as well. So you don't have to already have it memorized, or even certain themes that really just sound familiar to the Book of Ruth as a whole. So what I want to do is, as we read through the story of Yehuda and Tamar, I want you in the back of your minds to be thinking, what here sounds familiar to Megillah Ruth? And after contrasting these stories, I will have a chance to look at the actual story of Ruth and Boaz and the Goren, compare and contrasting them. As always, the goal is to kind of come up with meaningful takeaways. And again, we're going to see how this really is going to give us some deep insight into the community that exists, or how they're practicing really in Megillah Ruth. Okay, so with that, let's jump in. Source number 1, the story of Tamar and Yehuda. So to give a little context in Sefer Bereshit, this happens right after the sale of Yosef. Yosef and his brothers, and now the Tanakh, really the Chumash, really zooms in a little bit onto the story over here. Not really just the story, but really focuses on the character of Yehuda. So here we go. So it starts off by telling us a little bit of an introduction at the beginning of this parak, Bereshit Lamed Chet, Bereshit 38, that Yehuda has left his brothers and he's married the daughter of a Canaanite woman. We'll leave that. I'm trying to leave this without commentary. We're going to read through the story first, and then we'll see if we have any parallels. And he and his Canaanite wife have 3 sons: Onan, and Shelah. And we're going to start here really at Pasuk Vav, Pasuk 6. So Yehuda's sons start to get a little bit older. It's time for him to marry them off. Pasuk Vav, Vayikach Yehuda isha le'er bechoro v'shema Tamar. Yehuda marries off his firstborn son to a woman named Tamar. Pasuk Zayin, Vayhi bechor Yehuda ra b'nei Hashem vayimtehu Hashem. Yehuda's firstborn, is seen as evil in the eyes of God. We're not told kind of what he did, just that he was evil, and God strikes him down. Pasuk Chet, Vayomer Yehuda le'onen, bo'ol esher achicha, vayevam ota, vehekem zer la'achicha. In Pasuk 8, Yehuda turns to his middle son, to Onan, and says, go, sleep with, or here, marry, right, your brother's wife. And he used the word yavam, levirate marriage, or yibum, and there's some aversion a little bit over here of yibum that we'll see. It ends up being a little bit different when we're given the mitzvah in Sefer Dvarim, but, engage in this levirate marriage, and you will establish, an offspring for your brother. And here again, the idea that was seen was that if a man died without having children, then his brother, in certain situations, could kind of take his place, marry his widow, and in having a child, that child wouldn't be considered the second son's, right? But it would be considered almost the brother who had passed away's son, who had died without an offspring, without a legacy, without anyone to carry on his name, and this child would be considered, taking over for that brother. Okay, so that's kind of what Onan is tasked with by his father, by Yehuda. But what happens in practice? Pasuk 10. Onan realizes, wait, this child, if I get Tamar pregnant, it's not going to be my child. It's going to be my older brother's child, which is the whole purpose and the whole, mitzvah of Yibum and what you're trying to accomplish. But he's really not so interested in this. And when he would sleep with Tamar, he would, do so in a way to make sure that she would not become pregnant, because he wasn't interested in, fathering a child that would be considered his brother's child and not his own. And what he did is considered, here we're told specifically kind of what, like, this act was considered evil in the eyes of God, and he is also struck down by God. Tamar, Pasuk Yudalef, Tamar Kalato. So Yehuda turns to Tamar and says, Shvi almana beit avich, go back to your father's home, remain a widow there, ad sheigdal Shelah bani, until my son Shelah bani gets older. So it's interesting here. What he's telling Tamar is Shelah isn't old enough yet. Let's wait till he's a little bit bigger, then he'll step in for his brothers and he'll do Yibum with you, right? He'll be miyavim you. But now we're told the internal thoughts of Yehuda. Ki amar pen yamutz gam hu ka'achiv. What's Yehuda's inner thoughts or inner motivations? It's not so much as Shelah is young, but he's like, I don't want Shelah to die like his brothers, right? We're told, like the narrator perspective is told, the older brother, the older brother dies, did something wrong. We're not sure exactly what. This middle brother dies, it seems, because he's not willing to fully go through with Yibum. But in Yehuda's eyes, who is responsible for these deaths? Tamar. She's this like cursed woman who everyone she marries seems to die, right? And Yehuda is not interested in having his younger son marry Tamar and put him at risk. But to left Tamar v'teshev bet aviha, and Tamar goes and ends up just staying in her father's home. Okay. Some time passes. I'm gonna just narrate this quickly outside. Time passes. Yehuda's wife actually dies. He has a mourning period. Then his mourning period is over, and he goes to a sheep shearing festival with his friends. Pasuk Yud, we're told that Tamar finds out that he's going to this sheep shearing festival, and she decides to embark on a plan. Pasuk Yudal, what does she do? She gets dressed, takes off her widow clothes. She puts on, fancier clothes, puts on the scarf, and she goes to sit at the crossroads. And why? Here's our rationale, because she's seen that Shelah has actually gotten older. He's a marriageable age, and he has not yet been given to Tamar as a husband. Pasuk Tedvav, Yehuda, Caesar, Vayarik, Yehuda, Ve'achshev Elazorah. He thinks she's a prostitute. Kiki Stapaneh, because she covered her face. Pasuk Tedzayin, Vayetale El Haderech, Vayomar Havana Avo Alecha, Kilo Yada. He propositions her because he thinks she's a prostitute. He does not know that she's actually his daughter-in-law. But Tamar Mati Tenli Kitabo Alai, what can I pay you so that I can sleep with you? And here Tamar basically says, he says like, I'm going to send you some sheep, but let me give you an IOU. I can't pay you right now. What can I give you as an IOU? Pasuk Yuchet, Tamar asks specifically for his chotzmech uptilech umatacha. She asks for his kind of stamp that he would use, and for his staff. And this was basically seen back in the day, almost, modern scholars talk about this a little bit. It would be like your credit card, your driver's license. She asks for his ID. Yehuda gives it to her. He sleeps with her, and she becomes pregnant. Okay. Fast forward in the story, a few months later, Tamar starts showing that she's pregnant. It's told to Yehuda that, Tamar must have slept with someone, right? Because he doesn't know that she actually slept with him. That's going to be the surprise twist. And in that case, in that specific case over here, actually, just part of the story also, Yehuda goes to try later on to try to pay her to get his belongings back, and he can't find her. Nobody can find her, so whatever. He goes on. It turns out that she's pregnant. Yehuda gets extremely angry, and he says, let her be taken out to be burned. Okay. And at that point, Tamar decides to speak up. And I'll just find the pasuk over here. And she says basically to Yehuda, if you want to know who the father is, if you want to know who I slept with, it's a person who these items belong to. And she pulls out again his staff, his signet ring. Here we're gonna skip down a little bit. It's this man's objects that is a person who got him pregnant. And then in Pasuk Chavav, we'll just turn back to the Hebrew. Vayikar Yehuda recognized it. Interesting, this is not our shir, but if we're thinking about the story of Yosef, right, and kind of Yehuda's character growth, it's similar, right? The language, the recognition that, Yaakov is given the coat that's covered in blood and said, do you recognize this? Now this is done a little bit to Yehuda, and he recognizes it and he says, Tzadkami many, she's more righteous than I, right? The fact that Tamar, interesting here, is almost like he's justifying her whole plan, her whole scheme. Ki al ken lo natatia l'shla b'ni. She's correct because all of this, he, reads her motivation. This happened because I didn't give Shelah my son for her to marry. That's why she went into this whole elaborate plan so she could marry or end up as part of the lineage, right, of Yehuda's family. And in that case, it turns out we're told, but Velo Yosif od ladata, but he never sleeps with her again, right? Later on, she has the babies. They're twins, right? And they're called Peretz and Zerah. Peretz is going to be important to us. So that's going to get us the lineage stated in Megillah Ruth. Okay, that's our story of Yehuda and Tamar. If anyone wants to post in the chat, I would love to hear any type of similarities in this story that is sparked in your minds that sounds similar to the Book of Ruth. So if anyone has any ideas, anything sound familiar, please feel free to post into the chat. And as you start thinking about what those parallels are, we're going to turn now to the original story in Megillat Ruth, towards the end of the story of Ruth and Boaz in the Goren. So we'll read this text as well, and then we'll see, well, what seems so similar about these stories? What are differences that we can highlight? And what can this teach us about the society taking place and living at Beit Lechem? Okay, so source number 2. Now we're going to jump to the story of Megillat Ruth. And I see, I'm just going to jump over here to the chat, right? Oh, Kayla's posted, right? That like Tamar and Ruth, right, are kind of justified later on by their husbands or the men in the story, for sure. That's definitely one aspect that we're going to see. And now let's keep reading in Megillat Ruth and see if we can draw out some more parallels. Okay, so a little bit of background. We spoke a little about this last time in our last class. We're now at the end of Perek Bet. And what we're told over here, and just summarize kind of part of this story, is Ruth has been gleaning in the field of Boaz. Boaz has been very kind to her. He tells his workers, don't bother her. He gives her extra grain. She's going to be the, most taken care of poor person, basically, in his field. And she comes home with all this extra food and sees her mother-in-law. And Naomi is overjoyed when she finds out that Ruth had actually been gleaning in the field of Boaz, because Naomi points out to her in Pasuk Chav, Pasuk 20, blessed be God who has not abandoned the chesed, the living to the dead. He's actually our Redeemer. It's like a divine providence story, right? Hashgacha pratit, I mentioned this last week, right? So Ruth and Naomi now, they really think, oh my gosh, like Boaz is going to marry you. He's favoring you. Like our lives are finally going to get better. We're going to be redeemed. It's going to be amazing. And Naomi tells Ruth, stick with his, na'arot, with the female workers. And this is for sure, this is going to be great. We're going to be redeemed. Our lives are going to get better. But as we said last week, time goes on. Pasuk Chaf Gimel, right? Ruth stays with at Boaz's field. Ad kalot ktsir sorim, until the end of the barley harvest, uksir chetim, until the end of the wheat harvest, and nothing has happened. Boaz has not reached out to marry her, to redeem Naomi and Ruth together, to redeem their property. Ruth is like, bringing home food, but her status, her future is not being changed. And she ends up after the harvest just returning to her mother-in-law's house. Let's move on now to Perek Gimel. So nothing has happened, right? There was all this anticipation, but Boaz had not acted. And now Naomi decides she's going to take matters into her own hands. She's going to create a plan for Ruth that will ultimately, at least in her eyes, force Boaz's hand, force him to basically kind of like pulling on his sense of honor, to force him to basically like, or I don't want to say force, to nudge him strongly to redeem Ruth, to marry Ruth, and to hopefully kind of like get things moving. So here's the plan. And let's think how this sounds similar to the story of Yehuda and Tamar. So here we are, Perek Gimel, source number 3. So Naomi turns to Ruth and she says, I just want you to be taken care of. I want to ensure your future here, which again, we pointed out last week is a nice role reversal of chesed, right? It's almost like Ruth follows Naomi back to Israel, because she kind of like, I always picture like she wants to take care of her mother-in-law who's getting a little bit older. And now her mother-in-law turns to Ruth and says, I want to take care of you and I want to make sure that you have a future. So what does she say? Pasuk Bet. Va'ata halo Boaz midatenu asher hayita ad naratav hinehu zoret ad goren asarim halal. Boaz is our kinsman. He's the person who's really supposed to redeem us. You've been hanging out in his field all this time. Tonight, he's going to be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Okay, Pasuk Gimel. V'rachatzta v'sachatz v'samta simlotach. Go bathe, anoint yourself, get dressed up. V'yarad goren, go down to the goren. Al tivadi leish ad kalato le'echol blishta. But don't let him see you till he's finished eating and drinking. V'yehi b'shachvo v'yadat et hamakom asher yishkav sham. And when he lays down, you should go know the place where he's lying down. I just want to point out, because we're going to see that even though there doesn't seem to be any sexual act that takes place, there seems to be a lot of Hebrew sexual imagery over here, right? Ishkav, da'a, like to know, in all these situations. Ubata v'galita margilotav. You should uncover his feet. Unclear what that means. V'shachavta, and then lay down next to him. V'hu yagid lach et asher tasid. And he will tell you what you should do. And interesting also to note, right, that Ruth so far has been very passive in all of this. Naomi's making a plan for her to basically go and then do whatever Boaz tells her to do. But I would say over here, it seems a little bit that the underlying impression, or kind of like, reading between the lines here, it seems like she's supposed to kind of go and seduce Boaz, assumingly Boaz will sleep with her, and then that will force his hand to then officially marry her, redeem her, redeem Naomi's property. Shalom al Yisrael, happy ending. And that's kind of where we're going over here. Okay, so what happens practically? Ruth says in Pasuk, hey, I will do whatever you told me to do. In Pasuk Vav, she goes down to the Goren and does everything that her mother-in-law commanded her. Now we're told what Boaz is doing. Pasuk Zayin, Pasuk 7. Boaz eats, Vayesht, right? He drinks, Vayitav libo. He's in a very good mood. Probably drunk some wine, right? Also, and he goes to sleep. And then we're told Vatavo Balet Vatigel Margol Tavatishkav, and she goes, there kind of at night, and uncovers his feet and lies down. In the middle of the night, like Boaz, like shudders. He's like, well, what's going on? I'm not alone here, right? There's a woman sleeping at his feet. Vayomer mi'at, but tomorrow anochi ruta matach ufarashta knafech al amatach like he goelata. He says, who are you? And here Ruth speaks. The first time we see her speaking, and what does she say? I'm Ruth, your maidservant. Uparashta knafech al amatach. Spread your robe over your handmaiden. Seems different interpretations see this as kind of like she's basically saying, proposing. She's like, marry me, right? He goelata. Why? You're our redeemer. Step up, marry me, put your take care of us and be our redeemer. And Pasuk Yud, Vayom Bruchat LaHashem, Boaz praises God and he says, you've done this great chesed that you're basically interested in me. He was kind of older at that point and not one of the younger men. Interesting, right? But then he says, I'll do it. I promise, this is going to happen. Pasuk Yud Aleph. But right now I'm going to take care of this. But again, Pasuk Yud Bet, there's another redeemer that's actually closer, which is interesting because we've been painting Boaz as kind of like, why didn't he take action? Why is he dragging his feet? It could be right. It seems over here that maybe it was, again, maybe a sense of honor, this idea that he felt he wasn't officially the next one in line. It was up to this other redeemer, this other relative, Ploni Almoni, to act first. And he says, Lini halayla, stay here tonight, and in the morning, im yigalech tov yigal v'im lo yachpatz legalech v'latich anochi chai Hashem shechbiyat haboker. And he says, I'm going to deal with this. In the morning, we're going to go. I'm going to find out the redeemer. If he wants to redeem you, great. So either way, your fortune is changing tomorrow. But if he does not want to take action, I will take action. I will redeem you. And he takes an oath, Chai Hashem, right? This is what we're going to do. And you can stay here till the morning. And he basically says, don't leave, Pasuk Yudala. These are our final Pasuk we'll read over here. Stay at my feet tonight, but leave in the morning. B'terem yakir ish re'ehu. I want you to leave before anyone would be able to recognize anyone else when it's still dark, right? Because it's still kind of, right? It would seem inappropriate for her to be walking back in the early morning and coming from his, Goran. That'll be a little bit sketchy. So wait in the morning. Don't wait in the morning, right? Till people are up. Get up, do it when people are still sleeping, right? I don't want anyone to know that you came here tonight. Okay. And I didn't give the ending of the story. We know the ending of the story is Boaz is true to his word. He goes the next day. He finds that redeemer, Ploni Almoni, who's like, I'm out. I'm not interested. Boaz steps up, redeems her. They get married. They have a child. The child is kind of raised or given to Naomi, right? Naomi's holding him. And we have this kind of full circle. Naomi's redeemed. Ruth is redeemed. Everyone is redeemed. Shalom al Yisrael. And that's our happy ending. Okay. If anyone says notice, I'm going to share some similarities and differences now. But if you noticed any more of them came to mind, please feel free to drop in the chat other similarities or differences between these stories. But I want to pull out a few that are noted by different mefarshim, by different modern scholars. And I gave kind of like a further reading at the end if you're interested in delving into this in a deeper way. But there's a lot of similarities between not just the story of the Goren, the story of Tamar and Yehuda, but really between the story of Tamar and Yehuda and Megillat Ruth as a whole. So I'll point out some examples. This is here our nice little chart over here in source 4. Number one, we have this theme in both stories, kind of like the protagonist, or maybe not always the protagonist, but kind of like someone who seems to have potential to be like a main character or a Jewish leader who basically leaves their brothers or leaves their nation to go to a foreign land and to intermarry. Either this is Yehuda, right, leaving and marrying the Canaanite woman, and again, it's unclear also Tamar, right, like the sons who they're marrying, like where did Tamar come from? And Elimelech, right, at the beginning of the story, Naomi's husband, going to Moab in the time period of famine, and the sons marrying Moabite women. Parallel number 2, we see in both stories this parallel of sons dying without children, and we're unclear why the sons die. It's interesting, the book of Ruth, Machlon and Kilion, Ruth and Orpah's husbands, we're not told really why they die. You could, Midrash talks about this, like maybe it's because they left the land, maybe it's because they intermarried, but we're not really told what they did. And then in the story of Yehuda and Tamar, we're told that is evil in the eyes of God, but we're not actually told what he did. It's kind of left ambiguous. And Onan, we're told because, he spilled his seed. That action is told what he did. The sons have terrible names, right? Names have great significance in Tanakh. Machlon and Kilion basically mean destruction or plague, right? Er and Onan mean like barrenness or mourning. In both these stories, we have a delay or refusal of Yibum, right? Either it's Boaz dragging his feet or Ploni Almoni in the story of Ruth, who's not willing to kind of step up. Or we have Yehuda, who is holding his, it's interesting. He's delaying it because he's holding his youngest son back. But the middle son, is also delaying Yibum because he's not willing to get Tamar pregnant. So it's like the people who are supposed to be doing Yibum and supposed to be kind of, establishing this child for the person who's deceased are not stepping up to do it. And ultimately, Yibum isn't really done by the closest redeemer, right? It's done by Boaz or kind of by Yehuda. And he doesn't even initiate it, right? But like it's done kind of not by the person you'd expect. Finally, focusing here on the women, right? In both stories, the women are active, the men are passive at the end, right? There's a subterfuge, there's a scheme that happens to kind of like nudge themselves into Yibum, right? To have this redemption come. Both of them kind of are hiding their identity. The plan seems to be pregnant. It's a little morally questionable, like the methods used in both. And we'll talk more about that with the kind of like the big reveal at the end. I'll just point out a few more common words in both stories. Haker, which means reveal, shachav, lie, nishkeh, to drink, tavo, to come, yada, to know, vayikam, they rise, right? We have these milot manchot, these kind of key words that appear in both stories, linking them linguistically. Finally, that was interesting also that Yehuda tries to send Tamar home. He's like, go be a widow in your father's house. Like, we don't want you here. Go home. It's not going to work. It's not going to work out. And that's kind of what Naomi does originally to Ruth and Orpah at the border of Moab. She's like, go home. I can't help you. Even if I had sons tonight, right? And they had time to grow up, like it wouldn't be time for you to marry them. Well, like Yehuda basically says, go to your father's home and wait till my youngest son gets old enough to marry you. So an interesting kind of parallel there also. Finally, just the key kind of linguistic tie-ins. At the end of the story of Boaz and Ruth, the elders bless them that their house should be like Beit Peretz. Peretz here is one of those children born to Tamar. And I brought the pasuk over here, right? Literally, like Tamar and Yehuda make an appearance, right? In the story of Megillah Ruth. But those are some great similarities, but what contrasts, right? What differences are highlighted when we kind of contrast these stories? So I wanted to just throw out a couple of differences. I think this is going to be important in framing it as well. So first of all, Naomi is the one making the plan for Ruth. It actually seems more parallel to almost like Rivka making the plan for Yitzchak to steal the blessings, right? It's like an interesting, like mother tries to get kid to kind of like trick someone else, right? To kind of, for the greater good, quote unquote. Unlike Tamar, who's really alone in her story and taking her own initiative to kind of ensure her future. This is going to be very important. Tamar and Yehuda do have relations, right? Tamar gets pregnant in that sense, outside, he thinks she's a prostitute. There's no marriage happening at that point, and he doesn't live with her. It's not like she becomes the wife after. He never lives with her again after that. While Boaz and Ruth, there's a lot of imagery, sexual imagery in the text, but it seems very clear that they do not sleep together that night. The Pshat makes that, a simple reading makes that very clear. And he said, let's wait. We're going to wait until we do this properly. I'm going to go to the elders. I'm going to go to the gate and I'm going to redeem you properly. And then we'll be married. Again, it seems like, Boaz isn't really stepping up to redeem her at first. He doesn't seem to be actively delaying her, which is really what Yehuda is doing, where Yehuda is telling Tamar one thing, but at the same time, he's like, I am zero interest in my youngest son, marrying her. Just left some open questions, right? I think it's interesting, kind of like when Naomi and Yehuda each send Ruth and Tamar home, like who are they really concerned about? Is this altruistic, like they really, or are they kind of looking out for their own? And it could be different in each case. Who's being redeemed ultimately in these stories, right? Is it Tamar? Is it Ruth? Is it, the son who died? Is it or Onan or Machlon, right? Who's really being redeemed? Is this for Ruth's sake, or is Naomi gonna kind of benefit ultimately? So I leave those as kind of open questions to think about as well. Okay, so we had our similarities and we had our differences. And now, before we do the takeaways, and I want to share some takeaways, which is going to get us back to our original story. And obviously, whenever Tanakh is doing this, it's nudging us. It's like these stories are parallels. Make sure to compare these, right? We need to get to the takeaways, but first, this is actually a trifecta. It's not just two stories that are parallel, right? The story of Ruth and Boaz at the Goren, Tamar and Yehuda and Bereshit, but also, and we mentioned this a little bit last week, the story of Lot and his daughters. And I want to kind of throw this in also. And I see also, right, some comments in the chat. This is great. Thank you, Kayla, for sharing, right? Right, the complicated parentage. We see how Ruth's son sometimes gets treated like Naomi's, right? Exactly, right. Tamar's sons, right, are not, right, considered the sons of heir. I think that's a really important point. Thank you for sharing. And I want to kind of just do a quick kind of analysis of the end of the story of Lot and his daughters, because I think here what we're going to see is a range of really three stories that all deal with almost the same theme, but each of them kind of like, one of them is going to go the furthest, one of them is going to kind of be in the middle, and one of them is going to try to like is going to be, I don't want to say sanitized, but maybe kind of like be like the most kind of like upstanding of the stories. We can almost kind of see them in gradations. So here, this is the end. This is source number 5. And now we're going to jump and just talk a little bit about Lot and his daughters. This is the end of the story of the destruction of Stone, which we looked at a little bit last week. And this story, just like, again, the story actually mentions incest. So I just want to, if anyone, as we're reading it, just a little bit of more difficult story. So just, be aware of that as we engage in reading this text. And the end of the story of Stone is destroyed. Lot and his 2 daughters are the only ones saved. His wife left also, but she turns into the pillar of salt. And Lot and his daughters are in a cave, basically. And his daughters basically, as the text basically tells us, think that it wasn't just Stone. They think the entire world was destroyed. A lot of interesting parallels here also to the story of Noah, which we won't get into now. Noah and the flood, but everyone can feel free to do that as a side project. And Lot and his daughters are there, and his daughters decide basically, or have come to the conclusion they are the only women left in the world, and their father is the only man left in the world. So what do they say? One turns to the other and basically says, let's get our father drunk tonight and let's sleep with him. I'll sleep with him tonight, and then you'll get him drunk tomorrow and you'll sleep with him. He'll get us each pregnant, and through us, the world will be continued. Interesting here also, right? Sounds, I want to say like, this is like bizarro yibum, right? Doesn't use the word yibum over here, but this idea of someone being redeemed, here it's almost like the world will be redeemed, right? Like kind of like that same kind of theme. I highlighted some of the parallel words, right? Nishkav, nishkeh, right? Lie down, to drink, right? They get their father drunk. Lot does not come off looking great in the story. He's very passive, right? His daughters are active, but it says he has no idea what happened. Mefarshim talk about like, really, you had no idea? Or and again, interesting questions like, is he totally innocent here or not? What about his daughters? Is thinking that the world is destroyed. Is that enough of a reason for us to have a charitable read on a story of incest, right? And them taking advantage of their father over here. Again, there's a subterfuge. The story ends with it happening exactly as going to plan. Both daughters get pregnant from their father. They name the first daughter names her son Moav, literally Me'av, from my father. And the second daughter names her son Ammon, for Ben Ami, son of my nation, a little less explicit of like where he came from. But this is the origin story for Ammon and Moab. We obviously care for our purposes a little bit more about Moab because this is the origin story for Moab, which gets us to Ruth. Okay, and I'll just point out over here, another fun chart, just similarities, connections, differences really between this story as we look at these 3 narratives. It's really a trifecta, right? We spoke before about Elimelech and Yehuda leaving, their families to kind of go to this foreign culture, and kind of intermarry. We saw that with Lot also. We referenced that last week, right? Lot leaves the family of Abraham to go to the foreign culture of Stone, similar to Elimelech leaving and going to Moab. But last week, we spent some time seeing like how really enmeshed Lot got into the culture of Stone. We said, an attempted version of like bizarro yibum through subterfuge, right here trying to redeem the world instead of trying to redeem like a specific person or themselves, right? Interesting question, right? That's also right with Tamar. It's interesting always to think about, right? Is she trying to redeem Er and Onan over here, or is she kind of like just doesn't want to be isolated on the side, and she's taking matters into her own hands, and she's like, I'm going to redeem myself. I want a place in this family, like I want a child as part of this lineage. Maybe just for pragmatic reasons for her place as a woman in society in the ancient Near East, or also maybe for altruistic, like she wants to be part of this family of the family of Abraham. So interesting to think about, what her motivations are, and here Lot's daughters as well. Are they trying to redeem the world? Or is there also kind of, and I don't think this has to be negative, I mean, putting aside the whole incest thing, but they want to redeem themselves, and what's the focus? Who's the focus really here, this redemption? We have a lot of drinking going on, right? A lot more here actively getting Lot drunk, as opposed to kind of Boaz seems to just be drinking, as part of the festival, or the end of the, like the threshing floor. We said the common linguistic parallels, shachav, nishket, tavo, yada, vayikam. And again, obviously the union results in the origin story of Moab, connecting us directly to Ruth and Megillah Ruth. But what are some of the differences? Over here, and we spoke about this last week, right? Lot may have left to go to Sodom, similar to Elimelech going to Moab, but Ruth, his descendant, reverses that. We spoke about last week of her being the tikkun, her being the redemption of that, because she leaves Moab and goes to Israel, right? Joins the Jewish people. Over here, the daughters of Lot, similar to Tamar, are the ones making the plan, right? They're the ones that are taking initiative, while Naomi is the one doing it on behalf of Ruth, which I think kind of highlights something different about Ruth, which we'll point out over here. Boaz and Ruth do not have relations, unlike Lot and his daughters, and unlike Tamar and Yehudah as well. And here, as I mentioned before, the daughters are really the ones getting Lot drunk, unlike Boaz and Yehudah, who seem to be just drinking because they're at this party, or the parties that are taking place, harvest or sheep shearing. Okay, so we've basically seen 3 stories, just to pause before we do our takeaways, that seem to be similar to one another thematically, linguistically, but with important differences. But they almost seem to be 3 kind of stories where you have, again, women taking action in different cases, right, of subterfuge to kind of attempt some sort of either actual yibum or, alternate version of yibum, of redemption in these 3 stories. And ranging almost in levels of appropriateness to inappropriateness, right? You have Boaz and Ruth, where everything is set up for them to sleep together, but they don't sleep together until like everything is, super 100% kosher, taken care of legally with the elders at the gate. Tamar and Yehudah, where they do sleep together, but later on he says, Tzadkami Mini, she is correct, and he kind of validates her somewhat, however we want to put it, like somewhat far out or like eclectic, route that she engaged in, or somewhat sketchy, however you want, to kind of get there, to the opposite extreme of Lot and his daughters, right, where incest is happening. And this is seen as, completely inappropriate, like paralleling more to what happens at the end of the flood story, right, with Noah and his sons. So we really have kind of like 3 gradations here of appropriateness to inappropriateness. So what are we to do with these 3 stories? What are we to do with the fact? What takeaways can we have from these 3 parallel stories? And how can this inform our original question, the question really of the series, of how do we go from revelation to realization, to understanding the society taking place in Megillah Ruth? So with this, the time that we have, and I'll encourage people, if you have your own chidushim, your own ideas of what we're supposed to take away from these 3 stories, from the similarities, from the differences, I would love to hear it. Please feel free to post in the chat. But I would like to suggest over here two takeaways, which I know for me, I found is I actually want to suggest 3 takeaways that I actually found very powerful, and I think can really give us some insight here as to what's happening in society in Beit Lechem. Okay, so what is the first takeaway? The first takeaway, and this is something that's seen often, throughout Megillah Ruth. We saw this in a different aspect last week, but ultimately, the first takeaway, I think, is seeing Ruth as a tikkun. Ruth as tikkun here as kind of like as a redemption, as a fixing of an earlier issue. And I spoke before about these 3 stories as almost like gradations, right? Like which one, how do we rank them in levels of appropriateness? And I think this is where Ruth and Boaz, or Ruth specifically as a character, comes as someone who's mitakin, or who fixes this theme throughout like Jewish history of what's been happening, of like the subterfuge of the initiative, but in like a sketchy way, to create redemption, right? Ruth is the one ultimately, this is the one story where they don't sleep together, and the focus is, we're going to do this legally. We're going to do this through din. We're going to do what, according to custom, according to law. We're going to go to the elders. We're going to have to find out if someone first in line, Ploni Almoni, and we're going to make sure that his claim that he's willing to give it up. And then we'll declare everything publicly and marry you, kedat bekedin, in an appropriate way. And only then, will they get married and will they have a child. And that's really, I think, this idea of roots is being metakein this and saying, yes, we can take initiative, but this has to be done in an appropriate way. Like, we're not going to dress up as a prostitute, even though she's told by Naomi, like, dress up in an enticing way, not prostitute, but enticing way, and seduce Boaz. That's not really the tachlis, practically. It's not really what Ruth is going to do. She's going to try to tweak it, right? She's going to try over here to make sure it's done halachically. And I want to just, as a midrash in source 7, I think highlights this in a very kind in a close reading, but in a very powerful way. So we'll look at source 7. It points out that in the pasuk, if we look back to kind of like Perek Bet, Naomi is the one taking initiative, and she's the one telling Ruth, go dress up, anoint yourself, take a bath, dress up in fancy clothes, and go down to the Gora in the middle of the night, right? Implying that you should go and kind of seduce Boaz. And in those pasuk, it says that first she should kind of like rachtza v'sacht, you should first go wash and anoint yourself. And later on, in that order, she's told, and then go down to the Goren, and then go down to the threshing floor. And it's interesting because the Pshat tells us literally that Ruth did every single thing that Naomi told her to do, and she really only like steps up a little bit, when she talks to Boaz and says, marry me. But here the Midrash points out that this actually, Ruth doesn't actually keep to this order. If we want to be like really, really super focused on the close reading here, I'll read the underlined part in source 7. He lo asta k'mo she'amra la chamota. She doesn't do what her mother-in-law told her. Ma asta Ruth. What did Ruth do? Lachar she'yardar hagoren asta. First, she goes down to the Goren, and then it says asta, and then she does, right? Meaning, and then it's implying that she gets dressed up. Shneimar, v'tered hagoren, v'ta'as kol asher tzipta chamota. Later on Pasuk Vav, what does it say? That Ruth basically went down to the Goren, and then it says she did everything her mother-in-law told her to do, implying over here that, in this reading of the Midrash, then she got dressed, anointed herself, etc. Why? Why reverse it? Why go down to the Goren in your normal clothes and then kind of get all dressed up? Ella Amra, what did Ruth tell herself, or what did Ruth say? Hador parutz ba'arayot here, ba'arayoti. This generation is rife with inappropriateness, with licentiousness, right? Shema Yeruatim Mekushetet. If they see me all adorned, walking down to the Goren, Vayamru Shema Zonahi. They're going to think I'm a prostitute. This is an interesting theme kind of seen in the Midrash. It's like almost as Moabite women seen as like very loose or very promiscuous. And Ruth, again, it's this tikkun, she's not like that. Like, she kind of takes steps to not do this. Here, I think this Midrashic reading is really getting to this idea in general, that like, I think it's interesting also because it seems from Perek Bet, Naomi's coming up with this whole plan, and then Ruth's like, yep, I'm going to do it. But I think here the Midrash is getting to maybe there was a certain, we can read into the text, a certain like hesitation by Ruth. She's respects her mother-in-law, is fine to go along with the plan, but to a certain point. She wants to sanitize it. She wants to clean it up a little bit. I'm not going down dressed like that. What are people going to say? I'll go down normally, and then I'm going to get dressed. That's what the Midrash is kind of pointing at. Or as we said over here, like Naomi's like, go down and do whatever Boaz tells you to do. And Ruth's like, all right, I'm going to go down, but then I'm going to say, ufresh kanfecha, right? Spread your canopy or spread your cloak over your maidservant, and it's going to be marriage. It's not going to be that I sleep with him, then he's forced to kind of marry me. Like, we're going to do this appropriately. And I think that's really an important kind of theme over here. This idea of Ruth, kind of like, all these different stories, Lot and his daughters, and then we have, Tamar and Yehuda, a little bit better, right? And then we get to, Ruth and Boaz, and it's the ultimate tikkun. And I think we see this in source 8, and we shared this last week as well, as that Ruth is really seen as a tikkun, as a fixer of many kind of, flaws and coming full circle, right? Why ultimately do we not accept someone from Moab or Ammon as a convert, or a male as a convert, right? And it says, Pasuk Hey, this is source 8, when the Jews left Egypt and they were thirsty and hungry and they really needed help, Ammon and Moab were like, nope, we're not willing to help. It's they're the Ammon and Moab is seen as like the themes of anti-chesed in Tanakh, right? And Ruth is seen as the theme of the ultimate person of chesed, right? She's a tikkun for that. She's a tikkun for Naomi's plan, and she and Boaz are the tikkun for this trifecta of stories, right? Of Ruth and Tamar and Yehuda, and of Lot and his daughters as well. So that's the first theme. I think this idea of tikkun, the idea of doing things in a halachic way, which I think again really bridges, going back to our original question, is a really nice bridge between revelation and realization of how do we make sure that our society is being kept to like a high level of Torah law and a high level of Torah sensitivities, right? Or of Torah values, right? However one might interpret those, right? Ruth is kind of here a little bit more, small c conservative. And she's the one who's kind of like reining in everything else, like the plans that are happening. So that's really the first thing, the first takeaway. The second takeaway I think that we see over here is this idea of women getting things done. And I think what we've seen over here in all three stories, and obviously, the Lot's daughters is probably the least charitable of a read, right? Or the most problematic, again, initiating incest in that situation. But, looking, let's say, focusing a little more on Tamar and Ruth, we really see this scenario of women who are taking action to nudge men in the stories who are not really doing the actions that they're supposed to be doing, right? Yehuda is zero interest in marrying his youngest son to Tamar. He's just shoved her off to her father-in-law's house, and he's never going to call. Look, we know that. That seems pretty clear, like in the story. And Tamar knows that also, right? But she's going to take this action to, and here it seems maybe to redeem herself, right? But she's going to take her action to nudge Yehuda into what he's supposed to be doing. And we saw with Boaz. Boaz is a much more charitable read, a much more, I would say, favorable character than Yehuda in this story, right? Boaz, we also saw, like by the end of Perek Bet, he's not taking action. He's not, Ruth is the best poor person, the poor person who's taken the best care of, in Boaz's field, but he's not really taking steps to marry her, to redeem her family. And again, I don't think this is malice. I don't even know if this is so intentional. It could just be that either he's very proper, he's like, oh no, there's Ploni Almoni, he has to step up first, or maybe he's oblivious, but he's definitely not stepping up. And it's Naomi and Ruth who are going to step up to nudge him in that case. And what I want to point out here is this theme of women nudging men who kind of need to be taking action in certain situations. For the case of Geula, because Yibum, levirate marriage, right, in this case, is an idea of Geula, is kind of initiating redemption, is a theme that we actually see going back to the story of Yetziat, or not even Yetziat Mitzrayim, going back to Shavuot Mitzrayim, going back to slavery in Egypt. And there's a Gemara that's also reflected in the Midrash here, source 9, the Gemara in Sota, that talks about the Darash Rav Avira taught, B'schar Nashim Tzidkaniot Shayubo Toador Nigalu Yisrael Mitzrayim. It was in the merit of righteous women that the Jews were redeemed from Egypt. And the Gemara goes on to say, and this is told in the Midrash as well, and we'll see this in a few minutes, that, talks about how, during the slavery, the men were slaves. They, their morale was low, they were exhausted, and they weren't really interested in physically procreating with the women. They weren't interested in relations. Because of that, there really was this fear that maybe the Jewish people are just not going to continue on, right? There's just not going to be another generation, which ultimately, if you think about it, right, is one of the goals of enslaving a people also, right? You get them so low down and so exhausted that just like that's going to be the population control. So what do the women do? And the Gemara tells us, they would go and they would find these fish, and the fish would kind of come up from the water. It was a miracle. The fish would come up into the water that they would draw, and then they would go and prepare this food, and they would go out to their husbands in the field. And I'll just read the underlined part, right? The same kind of words we saw with Ruth, right? They would go out here, they would take these fish to their husbands at dinner, and they would anoint them, and they would, give them the fish, and they would bond with them. And then what would happen, right? Then they would sleep with them, and they would have, intercourse here. It says over here, like between where they were out in the fields, where the men were working. And again, kind of like this is seen as like again, women taking initiative in kind of a eclectic way, right? Kind of in this case, in order to bring about here the redemption of the Jewish people. And instead, this is for them taking initiative to, procreate in this situation. That's what ultimately brought the Geula. And I think here we see these themes of redemption as well. And it's interesting because we talk about before, right, the stories of Ruth and Boaz, or Tamar and Yehuda. There's this question of like, yeah, they're taking initiative to bring redemption, but it seems to be done in like a slightly sketchy way. And there's different gradations of how sketchy. But is this also considered sketchy, right? They're going out, at least they're married, right? But they're going out to kind of seduce their husbands in the field. And we see this, Rashi quotes this again in the Midrash in source number 10. There's like a parallel tradition that, it wasn't the women were bringing fish, but they would use mirrors to kind of make themselves look good, even when the husbands were in slavery. So then they'd be able to entice their husbands to sleep with them, and they'd be able to continue to procreate, right? And here Rashi puts like the Midrash that later on, when they're out of Egypt and Moshe is soliciting donations for the Mishkan, for the tabernacle, that the women come and bring these mirrors. And Moshe first is like aghast, like these mirrors that people use to kind of make themselves beautiful. Like that's not this is holy work, the Mishkan, the tabernacle. We only want things that are used for Kiddusha. And God actually steps in over here, right? It says over here, the underlying part, source 10, Moshe was going to reject them. He's like mirrors that's used for the Yetzer Hara, right? To beautify people for relations. Like that's for the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. Like we don't want that in the Mishkan. Amarlo Kadosh Baruch Hu, God steps in and says, Kibel, accept them. I find these most precious more than anything. Such, strong language over here. God says through these mirrors that these women were able to raise legions or huge hosts in Egypt. Like this is how they were able to make sure the Jewish people continued. So again, I find this takeaway kind of, and it talks about again that same idea, the parallel. They would go and use the mirrors and seduce their husbands, right? And this is how they became the mothers of many children. And again, I think this is very powerful because I think we really see here Ruth and Tamar as part of this long line, or here I guess Tamar comes before and Ruth comes after, but the precursors and the continuers of this rich tradition of women taking initiative to bring redemption. When perhaps the men in this situation were not stepping up, for sometimes for good reasons, and sometimes in the story of Yehuda, perhaps not. Though again, I think being concerned about your son's future is also a way to have a more charitable read of Yehuda. But the men, for whatever reason, are not stepping up. The women take initiative to step up to bring redemption. They do it in a way that perhaps could be somewhat suspect. But here, remember we spoke about gradations of like what's the most appropriate. Here, God almost intervenes midrashically to say that this was appropriate. This was something that ended up, for the greater good and for creating, new generation of Jewish children. So that's really the second one. The first one we said Ruth as like the redemption. She's the one who's mitakein, the tikkun, the redemptive art of the story of all of these three narratives, right? Of doing it in the most appropriate legal way. And then the second one, we see that really it's this rich tradition of women bringing on the redemption. And again, there seems to be this theme of doing it in somewhat eclectic, somewhat surprising methods, but here are ones that are justified by God. Though again, we said I don't think every story, especially Lot and his daughters, and even Tamar and Yehuda, like open question for us to reflect on, like how appropriate it is. And finally, I want to give one final takeaway with the time that we have left that will ultimately kind of bring together, hopefully, the whole series. For this, and I called this kind of from law to lived experience. So for this, I want to start off, we're going to look at a midrash, but I want us to hear to kind of channel a beautiful idea by Dr. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, who writes, really fascinating books on Tanakh. I highly recommend them. So she has an article over here in one of her books where she talks about Megillat Ruth. And I gave an excerpt, but I'll just give a little bit of background to it. She starts off by referencing another article by Robert Cover, which some people might be familiar with, called Nomos and Narrative. And what she pulls out from kind of his theme or his idea is that really in the text of the Torah, in the text of Chumash, we really have two types of text. And you can think about this from what you're familiar with learning Chumash, and also from what we hear in Parshat Shavuot. There's the stories, there's the narratives. Think Book of Genesis, right? All the stories of the family of Abraham and all the brothers and the fighting, right? Or in Shemot, right? The Jewish people being slaves, or in Bamidbar, wandering in the desert. There's the stories. But then there's also legal texts. Think about all the times in Chumash where we're told about mitzvot, commandments, do this, don't do this. Here are the commands for this. Here are the commands for that. And some books are heavier, like Genesis is very narrative heavy and very, light maybe on the halachot, right? We'll think about Sefer Vayikra is very heavy on the laws and perhaps light on the narrative. And the chidush, or main idea that Robert Cover comes up with, is that you really need both to kind of understand the Torah. Meaning the legalistic sections will tell you what the commands are, but the narratives will tell you how to fulfill them, or why they're so important. And for one example, he talks about there's a law that is given, that you're not supposed to favor the son of a favored wife. Okay, that's a law that's given. If you have multiple wives, we don't do this anymore with polygamy, right? But if you have a favored wife and she has a son, you're not supposed, and you have multiple wives, do not favor her. That's the halacha, that's the mitzvah. But if you want to know why, read the stories in Sefer Bereshit. See what happens over and over again when someone favors one son over the other. So that's kind of the chidush that's given over here by Robert Cover. And Dr. Zornberg comes and applies this to Megillah Ruth. And she starts off in source 11 by bringing this midrash. And she quotes Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera says, Megillah zo ein ba lo tuma v'lo tara v'lo isur v'lo heter. Rabbi Zera says Megillah Ruth actually does not contain in it any laws of impurity or purity or what's allowed or what's not allowed. So what was the point of it? If there's no mitzvahs in it, why is it written? It's only written to tell us how great the reward is for people who do chesed, because if you look through Megillah Ruth, according to this midrash, you're not really going to find any mitzvahs. Okay, now Dr. Zorber comes in source 12 and says, that's not exactly true, that there's no mitzvahs in Megillah Ruth. And she's going to connect now that idea we just shared by Robert Cover of like the narrative and the law. So what does she say? I'm going to read it together. The central message of the Book of Ruth, declares Rabbi Zera, is not embodied in law, but in narrative, right? The book tells a story about the good things that happen to good people. I'm going to skip a little bit to the underlined part. I suggest that Ruth is a narrative that displays the core meaning in dynamic form. Here, chesed moves and breeds and generates. Here we can take the measure of its uncanny power. Skip to the other underline. But here too is Boaz encouraging Ruth to glean in his field, instructing his reapers not to shame her, but to leave the forgotten stalks for her gleaning. His goodness, however, is precisely an expression of the legal requirements of his situation. That is, of the prohibitions and permissions that the Midrash maintains are not the subject of the book. The laws of the field as they are sketched out in Leviticus are given dramatic form in Boaz's world of chesed. So what Dr. Zornberg really maintains over here, which I think is just a beautiful way to bring together the whole theme of this series, is that if you want to know the halachot of how to take care of poor people, the halachot of Peah and Leket, of what you're supposed to leave in your field for poor people. If you want to know the laws of Yibum, right? You can find those in Sefer Vayikra, in Sefer Devarim. You can find them, you can read them, you can learn them. Great. But if you want to know how these play out practically in people's lives and what they look like, look at Megillah Ruth. It may not have the mitzvot, but through its narrative, it gives voice and dimension and depth to how these mitzvot are kept in a lived society. And for her, really, the hero of the story in this situation is Boaz. It's through Boaz's chesed for Ruth, telling his workers, make sure you take care of her, drop a few extra sheaves when she's doing this, and perhaps what we can see also through, the stepping up in the Yibum and all of these cases, that's how you're going to see the lived experience of chesed, of these laws come to life. I think this is beautiful, and I think this brings everything together. However, in our last 2 minutes here, I want to perhaps suggest an alternate riff to this. For Dr. Zornberg, it's Boaz is really manifesting how these laws play out in society in a positive way. If you want to see how chesed is done in a beautiful, amazing form, read Megillah Ruth, and those mitzvot come to life. I want to actually push back on that a little bit. I agree with her chidush, with her thesis 100%, but I want to kind of come back to what we've said earlier, and we spoke about this last week, that Boaz in this case, he's doing the mitzvot, but is he doing them full-heartedly? If he really cared about Ruth, would he send her home with here's some extra grain, and I dropped a few extra sheaves, or would he have, jumped then without being nudged to go and redeem her publicly and take care of her? And, he knows his cousin Naomi is living in poverty, after she was a very rich, everyone's just fine with Naomi living there and not really, being respected. And Ruth, who came to this foreign land, is just looking around, in fields for food, she's scavenging, she's forced into poverty. Is this really chesed come to life in its ideal form? I want to kind of posit that, yes, if you want to learn how these mitzvot come to life, look at Megillah Ruth 100%. But don't look at it to see it done 100% well. Look at it to see that chesed in an actual lived society is really hard. Chesed is messy. People don't always get it right? Boaz here could have probably done more. We saw that midrash at the end of last week, he helped, he stepped up, but he has to be nudged, by Naomi and Ruth to get himself to the finish line to actually redeem Ruth and take care of her and make sure that happens. And I think for me, my takeaway for this, and I'll bring everything together here, is that we really see these two kind of poles for Shavuot, right? We have the 10 Commandments, the Aser HaDibrot, Matan Torah, and then we have Megillah Ruth. And I think sometimes we can look at all these commands that are given and we can say, on one end, maybe Megillah Ruth is everyone going above and beyond, and it's this amazing manifestation of chesed, and that's the ideal we have to strive for. But I think we can also say perhaps Megillat Ruth shows a society that's trying, but isn't always getting it. And for me, I find that the most relatable, right? Like we're trying to implement these halachot, we're trying to create societies, communities based on chesed, based on taking care of each other. But as we know, sometimes easier said than done. And sometimes we're really trying, but it's messy and we don't always get it right. We don't always, take care of the people on the peripheries, right, of our communities, right? Perhaps sometimes we're like, oh, I gave tzedakah, I did this, I had a Shabbos, I invited someone for Shabbat, but there's more that could have been done, right? There's more that could have been done. I think that's kind of the message, the validation that we don't always get it right, but chesed is messy and lived experience, halacha, and putting, the mitzvot that we're given into reality, into actuality is going to be hard. It's going to be messy. But again, as it said in Pirkei Avot, right? Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. It's not up to us to finish the work, but lo atav befarim lehivat. It's not up to us to give up totally either. We have to try. And hopefully with that, with these two texts and everything we've learned in this series, balancing the Aseret HaDibrot revelation with Megillat Ruth and seeing a society that is trying its best, but sometimes can maybe do more, is kind of a good message for us and what we should be taking, as we go into the holiday of Shavuot, as we re-accept the Torah for ourselves and think about how we are actualizing these mitzvot and values in our own communities, hopefully a lot for us to take to heart. So again, I want to thank the Jerisha Institute. I want to thank Caleb Bloom. I want to thank Rabbi Jonathan Kelson. And again, I'm happy to stick around if people have questions or my email. I'll just jump up. Well, I just show you quickly down here. If people are interested in learning more, you can find it over here. A couple of articles to read. Otherwise, my email is up here if anyone has questions or any follow-up. And thank you again so much. And Kayla, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Gordon. This was a lovely class. Thank you, everyone who came. This is the last week of Sefira Zman at Drisha. Things are wrapping up, but learning continues. Coming up, starting this Sunday, is Mishnah in Depth with Leora Belinsky on Gittin, following the Mishnah Yomi schedule. And if you'd like this class, if you'd like to catch up with the past one, recordings will be posted to Drisha's website and to our YouTube page shortly. Shortly within a few weeks. And with that, thank you, everyone. Have a good night and a bit of an early Chag Shavuot Sameach.